Okay, hello for the last webcast of the academic year for us, I guess. And I have it all on PowerPoint today. So we'll go to that actually right now, and I'll explain what I've been trying to do with this once we get started. So the first slide, please.
Just a minute. Wait. Okay. Okay.
Okay, well, you can see the cover of this book, Hidden Valley Road, by Robert Kolker. I think it's Lois Walker in Vancouver that I need to thank for calling that book to my attention. It's just a fascinating book. This is the first presentation that I've ever done on it. Just finished it this morning, actually, and couldn't include everything I wanted to include. I really think this would be good required reading for any first-year student in the mental health specialty to get them oriented. It's I can't be more positive about it. So also I'd like feedback at the end from some of you at least as to whether this style of presenting works. And I'll be talking about the PowerPoints and whether they add or detract to following along. Okay, next slide, please. I want two quotes here to set the stage. Next one. This is from the book itself on page 330. Lindsay, one of the people you'll get to know in this presentation, understood now more than ever that we are more than just our genes. We are in some ways a product of the people who surround us, the people we were forced to grow up with, and the people we choose to be with later. Our relationships can destroy us, but they can change us too and restore us. And without us ever seeing it happen, they define us. We are human because the people around us make us human. Yeah, I was very taken by that quote. We'll come back to Lindsay, a character in the story, a little bit later. The next one, please. And this is to say that the primary, did I miss a slide here?
No.
No, I missed something.
Mike, this is the next slide.
The primary purpose of doing this presentation is to illustrate the concept that is routinely missing from the understanding of clinical problems in mainstream psychiatry and medicine. Bowen Theory's concept of self and variations of self on a continuum in the human population worldwide.
I have to let this person in who's late. I'm sorry.
All right. Yeah, I'm missing a slide here.
Mike. I have to unplug this again. Person who just joined, would they please? With the person who just joined, please turn off their audio. This is pretty disruptive. I've had to stop the slide presentation to bring you in. Sorry, everybody else. We'll resume in 1 second. Okay.
Okay, what's the next slide?
Mike, please put your computer away.
I just, if I want to use the computer,
Mike,
Fine.
please.
just show me that's the second slide. And what's the next slide?
Mike, you're going to have to work off of this. Please put your computer
the-
away.
Just tell me what the next slide is. Let's go to it. Yeah, somehow I missed somehow left a slide out of this presentation. And I wanted to definitely alert you to it. I don't know why it's not there, but it didn't. Okay, we'll just skip it. It was a quote from R.D. Laing, actually, that I thought is one way to introduce what I'm talking about here today, but not to equate in any way R.D. Laing with Bowen Theory and his ideas. But there is a relationship of sorts there. So that's why I had this slide. Okay, next slide, please. So these next 3 slides are of the family that's featured in Hidden Valley Road. The Galvin family for the husband, and the Blaney, I think, family for the wife. So as you can see, the husband in this case, Don Galvin, born 1924, died 1975. I think I got that wrong. But he's the youngest of the 3. If there are other siblings, they weren't mentioned in this book. And Mimi over there on the right side originally lived in Houston, Texas, oldest daughter of 2 girls. And her parents divorced, and then her mother remarried and divorced again, and they were living in Queens, New York at that point. So Don and Mimi, the next generation, most of their lives have been in Colorado Springs. Don was involved with the Air Force Academy, and they lived in Colorado Springs. And they married in 1944. They're both deceased now, but they had 12 children. Now, these ones that are spackled are the ones who at some point in their lifetime received the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, that particular phrase didn't stick for all of them. Some were shifted to bipolar and that sort of thing. They're all quite impaired. So that was 6 of the 12. The first were boys, 10 boys, and then 2 girls came along. Next slide, please. So these are just to show that their connections. Donald did marry Jean, and they eventually divorced. We'll be talking a lot about that. Jim married Kathy. That marriage lasted longer, but it was real problematic. John and Nancy are the first of the 3 not to get diagnosed, have kept their distance from the family as a couple with 2 children. but he has been free of anything close to psychotic symptoms. You see Brian there, the fourth, and we'll be talking about him. That's Noni, his girlfriend, who he ultimately killed and then killed himself. We'll come back to that. Then Michael with 2 marriages, a couple of kids. Richard with a marriage and divorce, 1 kid. Joseph, the 4th brother to receive a schizophrenia diagnosis. Mark, no diagnosis, but also a divorce, 2nd marriage, successfully. Matthew and then Peter, the last 2 boys, both who received that diagnosis in their lifetimes and get stuck in one form or another in the psychotically range. And then Margaret and Lindsay, the last 2. Margaret was married to her first husband, and then that split, and now has been successfully married to a second one. And then Mary, who took a name Lindsay for a number of reasons, also as a middle name, married Rick, and they have 2 kids. The older daughter is the firstborn, actually works in a lab now studying the genetics of schizophrenia. Next slide, please. So I wanted to have a section about Mary because I think Mary is the best functioner out of the 12 and how she got there in addition to her position in the family early on growing up. But this is about Donald, the firstborn son that I mentioned. They called the father Don and the son Donald. And I'm just going to read you some quotes from the book and let you follow along. Some of these are paraphrased. Donald was not what his parents assumed him to be. Not, in other words, not like his father. He was a quiet kid, not super popular. He got average grades and liked to be alone. He went to Colorado State for college, not the Air Force Academy like his father did. Growing up as the oldest, he exercised supreme authority over his younger siblings. He was a mischief maker, a bully, an instigator of chaos, and could be mean and aggressive with his brothers. When some of the kids told the parents about Donald's mean behavior, they took no action. They couldn't believe Donald was capable of doing negative things to his siblings. Donald was said to be Dad's favorite. And these facts come from Kolker's interviewing of the surviving children. I think when he got this book started, both parents had died. So Donald was Dad's favorite, but his siblings were terrified of him. Most of the sibling interactions were also about domination on down the line, one dominating the next, etc. On the other hand, he was a clean-cut teen who was featured in a photo that took up half the front page of a local newspaper. Donald was a subject of great admiration in and out of the family. Around age 17, Donald, standing in front of the kitchen sink, unexpectedly smashed 10 dishes to pieces that night. Again, Don and Mimi wrote it off. However, Don suspected there was something wrong with Donald. Donald felt trapped, frustrated that he was not the person he wanted to be. And this is around age 17. Donald was growing more afraid and sensed that something was happening to him. When Donald started at Colorado State in 1963, his inner fears were not on display, not even to his family. His goal was to be a doctor. When Donald spent time from college at home, the fierce sibling conflicts were unchanged, especially between Donald and the number 2 brother, Jim. Donald punched out Jim with a full right uppercut that knocked him out. Next one. Next one, please. Oh, at the beginning of his sophomore year at CSU, Colorado State, he went to the campus health center because of a cat bite. He offered no explanation of how it happened. Later in the spring of his second year, Donald returned to the health center, this time worried that he was infected with syphilis, getting it from his roommate, even though no sexual intercourse had occurred. In April 1965, he visited the health center for a third time, claiming that one of his brothers had attacked him and was causing him now back pain. He spent one night in the infirmary. In the fall of 1965, now a junior, he was attending a pep rally and jumped inexplicably into the bonfire and set his sweater on fire. Staff members had to go in and pull him out. Learning what happened, the health center staff pulled Donald out of his classes and sent him for a psychiatric evaluation. After 4 visits with the psychiatrist that fall, in January 1966, he wrote that Donald had no evidence of a psychotic process. The doctor recommended that Donald go back to his classes but continue with psychiatric help. The psychiatrist did say that Donald had emotional conflicts that could have played a role in his action, but that was not specified. So Donald propelled himself back to campus life and study at the start of 1966. He experienced significant emotional distance from others, leading to his feeling desperate for people connections, especially with a female. He still hoped he could be the man his parents thought he could be. He did connect with a female classmate, even talked marriage to her, but the relationship ended. She ended it, and that wasn't specified what happened. Donald was shattered by this, but told no one. He pursued the girl with multiple phone calls, but to no avail. Donald was also in a rather desperate financial circumstance, but could not admit it to his parents. He could not pay the rent on where he had been living, but did find an abandoned fruit cellar near campus. He had electricity and heat there, but no water. This was in the fall of 1966, his junior year beginning. He was sleeping there on a mattress alone at nights. It went on this way for many months. He eventually went back to the health center, reporting he had again been bitten by a cat. The center referred him back for a full workup by the psychiatrist. He opened up to the doctor this time regarding doing bizarre, destructive things. He was fixated on death and ending his own life. He said things were getting worse for him. He said he had killed a professor and thought about killing another person. He also reported 2 suicide attempts in his life, one at age 12. The doctor also found that he had in fact killed the cat. He diagnosed Donald with possible schizophrenic reaction. By the end of 1966, Donald was saying that the CIA was after him. He told his family they were all being shot at. Hearing this, his parents went and got him, bringing him home. They rejected the idea of a psychiatric hospital, opting for he will get better on his own. Don and Mimi did take Donald to the Air Force Academy Hospital, which was where Don was still employed, and to a physician the Galvins knew very well. The doctor wrote Colorado State a letter stating Donald had an acute situational reaction, said bad breaks had caused it, and now he was better. It enabled Donald to return to school after Christmas 1966. When he returned to school, he was seeing therapists at the health center and was said to be not to be psychotic. Donald then started dating again and got engaged again. After several months, the parents became ambivalent about the relationship. Jean, the woman he was engaged to, did not want children, which upset Donald a great deal. Meanwhile, Donald and Mimi are telling no one about Donald's breakdown. Donald continues with therapist appointments at the health center. The breakdown being the night he jumped in the bonfire. John and Jean's marriage in 1967 deteriorated rapidly over its first 3 years. His psychiatrist observed that Donald exercised rigorous self-control that flattened his personality. I thought that was an interesting way to think about the flattened affect of the 4 A's of schizophrenia, that it's a rigorous form of self-control, not that the person lacks emotion. Could be. Jean complained of his distancing, resistance to any sexual activity, and often threatening nature. Donald said, "I am a mirror of what other people want me to be." Now, when I read that in the book the first time, I said, I got to do a presentation about this. I've never seen it laid out so clearly, what it's like being a person with very little solid self. The psychiatrist said that he had given in to Jean's demands, suppressed his own feelings, and had trouble expressing any emotions. Donald said, "I'm a child, fearful of making any decisions." He once tried to kill Jean and himself, but did not succeed. Donald was increasingly losing it and was diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia. He was committed to Pueblo State Hospital in 1970. He fought the hospital every step of the way. Donald's first fiancée had left him. Now Jean had filed for divorce while he was in the hospital. This is after 3 years of marriage. Donald was released from this first hospitalization after a few weeks and received no jail time for his threats and actions to Jean. Donald went to live with his parents. His parents had hidden these recent events from family and others. I mean, there's also quite a conspiracy in a sense going on here. Donald flips out again rather quickly, and the police took him back to the hospital. The second hospitalization did nothing to reduce the fighting between Donald and Jim. It totally destroyed Thanksgiving dinner that year. Donald was now having religious delusions and hallucinations. The drug stelazine helped him realize that his spiritual delusions were in fact not reality. Donald was severely shaken by the loss of Jean. It triggered him back into psychosis. His psychiatrist suggested that Donald seemed to choose to become psychotic again in face of this serious relationship disruption. Interesting perspective, I thought, choosing to become psychotic again. I remember in reading about John Nash, he talked a lot about the comfort he felt from being psychotic, that it could stabilize him and not let him feel so isolated. Donald decided not to try to contact Jean again after his actions landed him back in the hospital again. He improved there, got a job, and was released in May 1972. However, the cycle started again. He physically threatened his parents. His mother got a court order to send him to the state hospital yet again. He was discharged in August 1972. In the spring of 1973, he was admitted to Oregon State Hospital when he was again trying to contact his ex-wife. He was confused, disoriented, uncooperative, and had no memory of that hospitalization. Then in the fall of 1973, his fourth brother, Brian, shot and killed his girlfriend, Noni, with whom he had broken up about a month earlier. Then he shot and killed himself. Donald attended the funeral, but was soon back in the hospital with very intense religious delusions. He was hospitalized now for 5 months. This did not stop him from looking for Jean. Donald continued to cycle in and out of the hospital. Once, 3 of the brothers were in the hospital, Pueblo State, at the same time. Next one. Donald walked 200 miles a week. Just put that in because of the kind of energy this guy had. He was living with his parents. Jobs came and went. He did this while engaging religious visions and preaching religion to whomever would listen. Over the next 10 years, he had 6 hospitalizations at Pueblo State. Don and Mimi were becoming increasingly afraid of Donald and told him to get his own apartment. His parents eventually accepted him back with them, and he lived peacefully there between 1980 and 1983. While Donald was at home, he accompanied his mother doing grocery shopping, did household chores, and gave Mimi a sense of purpose, was described as. He stayed out of the hospital for 7 years, taking antipsychotic meds, even though there's no guarantee there, and a mood stabilizer. He tried living in a boarding house, but that never lasted very long. He would decompensate there, and that would trigger a hospitalization. In the 1990s, Donald confided in Mimi that as a teen, a close family friend sexually abused him. It turned out to be a priest of homosexual abuse. His mother began blaming the priest for the state of her family. Mimi renounced her faith over it, which was Catholic. Donald's mind could still go off the rails with crazy ideas continuing to be part of him. After his mother died, he told the author of this book that Mimi was too bossy, too bossy. Next one. So my conclusion about the overall process of Donald's life is that his lack of self is reflected in the behaviors that surfaced leading up to his psychosis. I think this is a better explanation than the term schizophrenia offers. He had so little self and associated high level of chronic anxiety for all the vulnerabilities you just heard about, that it got eventually bound, as Bowen Theory would say, in the psychotic process, and maybe stabilized him a bit as long as he could stay out of the hospital, because the hallucinations and delusions did not go away on medication, but it did calm him. Powerful brain disturbances is one of the many places such anxiety can come to rest. Time does not permit a discussion of how psychiatry has dealt with the nature-nurture dilemma. The book covers it extremely well. I found that those sections very, very interesting, bringing me up to speed on things that I was unclear about genetic research and schizophrenia, and has wound up concluding that nature and nurture are both important. Genes do not cause it, but are part of the total project. Now, I was going to do a piece about Mary, who I think is probably the best functioner in the family unit, and now is definitely a big mother of the next generation, as well as a review of the science that was presented, but time does not permit that. So I decided that I'd now talk about the relationship between Don and Mimi, and there's many things about that spread throughout the book. So after having Peter, the doctors told Mimi she should not have any more kids. Mimi did not go for it. She still wanted 12 kids, even after number 11 was the first female. She was 40 when Mary was born. When Margaret told Mimi that Jim had molested her as a kid, Jim is number 2, Margaret would be number 11, Mimi sloughed it off. That gives you a kind of a flavor, I think, nicely, kind of the atmosphere inside this family and how they dealt with their own anxieties, like, for example, sloughing it off. Despite all that had gone on with their children's first hospitalizations, Mimi and Don, Colonel Galvin now, remained optimistic about the future. Mimi blamed Donald's wife for the problems in their marriage. No big surprise there. Mimi was a perfectionist, but she tolerated Donald acting crazy in their home. Everyone in the house on Hidden Valley Road seemed to be operating in a world of no consequences. Donald once threatened Mimi with a knife. When John brought Nancy, his future wife, to be home to meet his family, the house was dominated by hiding Donald from view and outwardly denying anything was wrong. It's a little spooky, I think. Nancy later commented that the house seemed like an emotional shambles, drenched in confusion and anarchy. Next one, please. Oh, Mimi's classic lecture to her kids was, "It's my way or the highway." In connection with this disturbance of some sort with the neighbor, she denied that her boys had done anything wrong. Over time, Mimi became embittered. She could get nasty at the kids' actions and accuse them of being just like Donald. At home, Don basked in the paterfamilias role while Mimi handled the details. Next one. Don enrolled in night classes at the University of Colorado in pursuit of a PhD in political science. Don was devoted to his own interests. Mimi described him as an armchair father. He was away from the house a lot while Mimi maintained the routine. Don had parachuted out of C-47s, rappelled down cliffs with his father, played ice hockey, was a track star, all-state lineman on his high school team. He was popular, well-liked, and handsome, just like his father. Don, the father, retired from the Air Force in 1966, seeking a new job overseeing programs funded by the federal government. His sons were in awe of their dad. Don and Mimi were also part of the arts and culture scene. Don often told Mimi the boys should not be coddled, that they should leave the nest and take care of themselves. Donald and Jim were still functioning okay at that point, but Mimi feared if she did not do right by all, things would crumble. Don gets his PhD at age 44. Brother Brian broke up in August 1973 with his girlfriend. Brian and Noni had argued constantly after the breakup. In September 1973, Brian shot and killed Noni, then shot and killed himself. The parents told their children that they had been killed in a bicycle accident. Don suffered a stroke in January 1975 at age 51. He was hospitalized for 6 months. He left with a right-sided paralysis and no short-term memory. He lost all memory of anything since 1945. Don continued to accuse Mimi of babying the boys, believing as he did in the school of hard knocks. Mimi responded this time by saying, "We let Brian go and look what happened. I'm done with letting them go." When their 10th son, Peter, was hospitalized psychiatrically, he wrote that Mimi, the psychiatrist wrote that Mimi was unwilling or unable to hear unpleasant news. Mimi did not want to listen to her son's hallucinations and fears. At family meetings, when Peter was hospitalized, he would rest his head on his mother's chest and would show a smile like a contented infant. To the doctor, the dynamic of omnipotent mother and dependent boy was most comfortable for her children to fall into. Sorry for the misspellings. The doctor implied to Mimi she was a prime mover in Peter's and by extension all the others' mental breakdowns. Both Don and Mimi were stunned and defensive. Mimi resolved never to let university doctors near her sons again. From then on, it would be the state hospital at Pueblo or no hospital. Donald slowly recovered from his CVA, but could not work. His only source of income was his military pension. He wanted Donald and Peter not to live with them, but Mimi blocked the idea. Michael, never diagnosed with schizophrenia, blamed a repressive upbringing for his sick brother's problems. Following Margaret's and later Mary's accusation of sexual abuse by their brother Jim, Mimi told them that her father had taken liberties with her and that her mother's second husband sexually preyed on Mimi's sister Betty. Eventually, Don locked Jim out of the house permanently. A genetic researcher studying their family was struck by Mimi's determination to care for her 6 seriously impaired children and her post-CVA husband. Don's first cancer diagnosis was in the late 1980s. He died of cancer in 2003. It was a carcinoma on his head in 1980s. The cancer spread, and he had 3 treatment periods over the next 15 years, finally dying. When both Margaret and Mary Lindsay had told their mother about Jim's sexual abuse, Mimi partly excused Jim because he was sick. Neighbors in the Hidden Valley Road social network saw Mimi as a saintly in her devotion to family. Doctors generally saw Mimi as pleasant and never out of control. She seemed a happy warrior. Mimi's short fuse occurred with her sons. Donald eventually lived full-time with his parents. He spent much of his time in his room. Mimi insisted it was Don who wanted the 12 kids. She served everyone. She converted to Catholicism, later renouncing it. She blamed Don's side of the family for the schizophrenia, believing it was inherited from the Galvin side. Mimi often felt judged by her daughters. When her daughters were adults, Mimi told them that their father had been hospitalized at Walter Reed Psychiatric Ward for depression early in their marriage. She also said that he had had multiple affairs with women during their marriage. The book author describes what he learned about Mimi from her adult children that led him to conclude that Mimi was averse to self-reflection, a perfectionist, as mentioned earlier, made many mean remarks and used the word should a lot in relationship with her family members. By 2016, none of the boys lived with her any longer. Donald had moved into assisted living with Mary Lindsay helping him when needed. Mimi was quite saddened by losing Donald's company. Mimi believed she had been a good mother, but opined that she said yes to the boys too many times. Margaret had been left out because her mother had focused so much, felt left out because her mother had focused so much on their sons. She was never schizophrenic. Mimi continued to think that it was when the boys left home that his problems arose, their problems arose. Mary Lindsay learned that for several years before he died, her father was having regular outpatient department electroconvulsive therapy at Pueblo State for depression, but hid that from his kids. Mimi knew, but never told the kids either. Mimi was never persuaded that nurture had anything to do with what happened in her family. It was genetically caused. Mary Lindsay, and Lindsay actually gave herself that middle name when she was sent to Hotchkiss to finish school. She thought being called Lindsay helped her fit in better there for some reason. Anyway, so she became Mary Lindsay. Told her mom that she was not convinced that nature had not been part of her brother's problems. Nurture had not been part of her brother's problems. And this is an example of, I think, what Mary was able to gain. And she was in individual psychotherapy and sounded like she got a lot out of it. Mary Lindsay gradually became less faulting of her parents, reasoning that her parents did not comprehend that things were going off the rails when they were. Mary Lindsay was also impressed with all the siblings had the amazing ability to shape their own reality. She viewed the schizophrenia as an outcome of nature and nurture working together. And again, if you think back in that quote at the beginning that I gave, that was Lindsay. So my conclusion about the Mimi, Donald parental triangle and other nuclear family members is that clearly this was a poorly differentiated family system. I think I've presented pretty good evidence for that. The typically encountered problem of assessing the intensity of the child focus and the unresolved attachment to the family of origin is common for all of us in Bowen theory. A problem is that the concept of emotional fusion is not in the consciousness of researchers. John McGrath is an Australian epidemiologist, states, psychosis is just what the brain does when it is not working well. I was fascinated by that. It's different than sort of looking for the specific cause. This way of understanding the brain fits well with Bowen theory in that the chronic anxiety associated with a person's basic level of self may play a key role in interfering with the brain working well. This does not dismiss the role of genes in activating a person's vulnerabilities. Reading this man's summary of the research, unfortunately, you never heard about Murray Bowen. He quoted Tedlitz in there, and it's all the old stuff about deprivation and that kind of thing. So I guess that's it. So again, I'd like to invite comments on the matter of presenting this, whether those slides were helpful to help you read along as I presented a lot of different information, as well as on your thoughts about the clinical case in general.
If you all could activate your video and type into the chat room if you have a question or comment that you missed to make. And when you are given the go-ahead, then you can activate your mic, please. Randy, are you in the queue?
I am.
Go right ahead.
He's our favorite leadoff hitter.
They're here. I was just wondering, Dr. Kerr, whether there was enough information in the book to understand how, from the standpoint of nurture and emotional process, the children who became schizophrenic became schizophrenic. In other words, was there enough information to explain the intensity, the greater intensity of the attachment to some of the children versus others of the children? Was that part of the scene?
I don't think there was enough attention to that. Let me say, I had a thought that just went out of my head about how to respond. I can't remember what I was going to say.
Okay. Well, then, the book apparently refers to the combination of genes, nature and nurture. Is there any further information, current information in the book about genes and their relationship to schizophrenia? My impression is that that's still pretty murky.
Yeah, I was surprised. Now I'm remembering what because this family was severely scrutinized with all DNA samples taken, and it was evident that not all the sibling, well, there was evidence of what was called, I'm forgetting the name, but it's a delay in brain processing, and it was associated with a particular gene, and that gene was present in many of the family members, not everybody, but not all those members were psychotic.
Hmm.
And I think that was useful, just opening the door to, just because the gene is there, it's not destiny. And it was some kind of delay in response that you would think could have been involved, where the person can't habituate when they react to something, and then they have trouble. Next time the same thing happens, they do it again and again and again and again.
Hmm.
There's an absence of what I think psychologists call habituation.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to fit with what could go wrong with a schizophrenic's mind. But, it didn't prove anything. And the most powerful thing, I think, was that at the end, two of the most famed researchers in genetics concluded that the family is very important in this, and we need to understand that better. The family. It's not just about looking at genes or what genes activate in the body. So that was encouraging.
Yeah. This final question. Was epigenetics included in the analysis of the relation between family environment and genetic expression?
Absolutely, it got some emphasis because that is a good, as you well know, a good place to think about the interplay of environment with genetics, and that mutations aren't necessarily necessary. It could be more about gene regulation. And I think that's really, Waddington first, I think, emphasized that idea of epigenetics back in the early 70s, famous biologist. And now that definitely opens the door for what are the environmental stimuli that are carrying this vulnerability into a problem. And as I wrote at the end of my presentation, I think the idea of chronic anxiety and how it can come out of a position in the family over time can then affect the brain through activation of various physiological systems, including the inflammatory system. So the book just left me thinking that it's not, psychiatry may not be as polarized as it used to be, at least according to what this author gleaned from talking to lots of these researchers, that they were leaving room for nature and nurture. And nurture is not about deprivation or child abuse necessarily, although it can be part of it. But as you know, it's part and parcel related to the unresolved attachment to the family. And that's so hard to quantify, again, as we both know. But anyway, I recommended that book for anybody starting out in the mental health professions because it is so thorough and gives us a great picture of like the Donald's story I was fascinated by, where you could just sort of trace he was reasonably okay, even though he was a very aggressive, domineering sibling with his younger sibs, until it's liftoff time, about 17, and then how ill-equipped he himself feels about going out in the world and how much anxiety that would then generate. All that, I think, can be explained best by the concept of level of self, something you've spent a lot of time thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And then the psychosis can pile in on top of that as where the anxiety gets bounds. And I think that's where genetics comes in and other factors, maybe toxins, bacteria, who knows, to fill the gap.
Mm-hmm.
You have a
Thanks.
comment to read. See that Kim Zibelman, could you read that?
Okay. Oh, you read this book, Kim. Great. You said you were struck by how average his family was by standards of how I, for one, experienced growing up at that time. Well, hopefully you're not carrying the gene.
So the next is Victoria.
Yeah, I just want to stick with that, how average his family was by standards of how I, for one, experienced growing up at that time. Just a very interesting thought to reflect on. I mean, I would agree with, was it Kathy, John's wife? He brought her home to meet the family, and she was just saw chaos everywhere and anarchy, et cetera, and all the words she used to describe it. This was not your average family, fortunately, I don't think, by a long shot. But again, where does it exist on the continuum? Harder to specify, and hard for science to include it as a variable if it doesn't even know about it. Okay, Victoria. Go ahead, Victoria. Houston was part of your layout, and Mimi Galvin, or Mimi Blaney, eventually lived there for a while. Then they went to New York.
Well, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah, I won't pick on you.
Some would say Houston has its particular challenges. Mike, Dr. Kerr, I was wondering if you had designed this book, if you had interviewed the family or been involved, what more would you have added? What else would you want to include to get a bigger, fuller picture?
Well, I would think anything that gave some inkling of the intensity of the unresolved attachments and the variation among the kids. I mean, there's a nice example with Mary, the youngest, from an early age, having the confidence in herself to stand up in a I don't know, first grade classroom or whatever it was. And when people said, how many are voting for Nixon? How many are voting for McGovern? She says, McGovern, McGovern, McGovern. She was the only one in the class that did that. And she was considered just more settled and organized. Margaret was not that way. And Margaret has a lot of grievances against the family. Fortunately, she and Kathy have a pretty good relationship that Kathy values. Mary values this as much as she does. So yeah, how to get at this intensity in a more objective way. You know it's there with all this chaos. How to describe it in more detail, exactly how this plays out.
Well, I know I was wondering about the past 2 or 3 generations in terms of whether there was any contact with grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, for some more than others, less for others. You know, was there some of that or none of that?
I don't remember, but I don't think that was covered hardly at all.
Yeah.
And there's reference to the parents of Don and Mimi.
Okay.
But what the parents came from, I don't think there's no data in there about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This was an interesting presentation, and I want to go read the book.
It's well worth it. I
Check it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Amy Post in Baltimore, or maybe Baltimore County.
Oh, or the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
I thought I had 2 kind of thoughts that emerged from your presentation. One, I think the book highlights how you could have plenty of good external functioning and still kind of be showing up in your family in a really different way. And I thought that highlighted for me the difference between functional self and solid self. And I wondered what would have happened in this family if less energy had been put on appearances and kind of how they were perceived in the environment and more toward goals for self, and whether or not they could even begin to form goals for self in any one person. And then I thought your description of Donald being fine until launch, and that it was triggered in part by the disruption. I was thinking too that how that really describes the functional role people play in the emotional system as being a way of deriving self. And that when the functionality in the system is disrupted, if there's no solid self underneath, it's much harder to figure out how to orient yourself. So it to me picked up the dependency piece on other versus on self in a way that I hadn't heard. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that Donald, description of Donald and how the psychiatrist framed the interaction between his wife and him, with him really being in a no self, one down position, and her clearly being an over functioning kind of person for him, as a one important dynamic in what was playing out. Okay, thanks, Amy.
So there's a comment in the chat room, a question: what motivated Kolker to write the book? That's from Carolyn.
As far as I know, Kolker only had one other book that was listed. I forget his background, and I don't think he explained. Yeah, the question was what motivated Kolker to write this particular book, get interested in this family. And it may have been covered, but I don't remember now offhand how he learned about this family and decided to write about them. I don't know. That would be a very interesting question to have answered. But he definitely does his homework Even though I call the book a documentary, not as maybe solid as some documentaries, but a pretty good effort to represent the family as it presented himself to him, mostly the information coming from surviving siblings. Donald, for example, is still alive and in that nursing care home, and who goes to visit him all the time? Good old Mary Lindsay. I mean, she definitely has become big mother of this generation. And then when her mother was dying, she was leading the charge to be there for her. And anyway, I guess I'm getting a little away from what you asked.
Margaret Otto.
Okay, Margaret.
It's just a basic, such a basic idea, but how different individual and family perspective are. I mean, just so radically different. And on a good day, I'll have an individual in my office, but I'll ask myself, what's the most serious symptom this group has popped, to try to get a read on the level of fusion and intensity. But it's such a basic idea, but so strikingly different.
Yep. Gotcha.
Is that all you want to say?
I think that's all.
Cheryl Lester, how might a timeline further illuminate the incidents that beset so many family members of this family? You want to read that, please?
Yeah, how might a timeline further illuminate the incidents that beset so many members of this family? That was something I didn't have time to do in trying to make it at least reasonably organized for today, but that could be another step. I think with Donald's story, I mean, how his symptoms, were clearly related to the changing context of his life, starting with the no self kind of development. And then with his wife, he definitely became the passive one. And Jean was the over-functioning one. And that's the way it was. I thought that psychiatrist who noticed that Peter, the 10th son, who was diagnosed initially with schizophrenia, then bipolar, that scene with the family being seen at the hospital and whoever was doing the interview noticing, Peter laying his head on his mother's chest and the look of contentment. Just picked up both sides of this. I mean, on the one hand, Mimi could be mean and nasty and dismissive and in the merry-go-round named denial for a lot of the crap that was going down in her family and trying to hide it. But on the other hand, she was a tender, protective, available mother. I think as much to the girls as the boys, except she was more anxiously focused on the boys. And maybe Margaret as the first girl, but I think, as I said, I think Lindsay came off as the freest. And I wanted to have that as a comparison to her experiences to Donald's, to try to show, how this development of a self can unfold over time for a kid growing up. I don't think we have enough information and study about exactly how that works as yet.
There's a comment from Cheryl, if you want to reference that for yourself. There's a good interview with Robert Kolker.
Oh, in the New York Times book review, recent. I'll go.
Have downstairs.
We still have it. I don't know if it was last Sunday or.
Just next comment, please, from Sarah Davis.
Okay, Sarah Davis, go ahead.
Right there. Read
Oh, could you share your thinking about the concept of union disease from the perspective of this family? especially interesting is Don Sr.'s series of inflammatory problems, CVA and cancer. Well, yeah, the way I think of the uni disease is that the level of basic self, which is the mix of solid self and pseudo self that people navigate with, and the chronic anxiety that can be associated with that, always looking at the context, which biology's been trying to do for over 100 years, is look at the context, not just the individual part. And that book I read about philosophy of cancer, I think is a huge step in that direction, that you need systems thinking to conceptualize the environment big time. But also, I've long believed that systems theory of the individual would be useful in combining Bowen theory with the individual, what these interactive processes do and how they translate into physiological changes, et cetera. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
You want to give her a chance? It's Sarah Davis.
Go ahead, Sarah, if you're not clear. There you are. Hi. Did I get anywhere near what you were asking?
Yes, I just always want to hear more from you about the uni disease concept, and this family was making me think about it. So.
Yeah, theoretically, the common denominator would be levels of basic self and the chronic anxiety that's associated with that. And the uni disease just suggests that where then that anxiety is bound within the individual. Bowen theory is about where it's bound within the family. There's no comprehensive individual theory yet that helps you understand where it's bound within the individual. But certainly genetics are going to play a part in that. Just like the overall context in any family that a person's brought into, multi-generationally and currently, is going to be very important to understand about how to explain what's going on. So the uni disease says that some of the basic physiological processes are underneath every physical, emotional, and social symptom out there. And I think its usefulness is in paying more and more attention to the person's context in which the disease is occurring. And genes and diet, that sort of thing are factors, but that's where I got the idea that was all. I saw multi-generational patterns in diabetes and compared them with multi-generational patterns in cancer, and they were identical. I think I wrote that up in my chapter this time. Mm-hmm. That's what got me thinking that, is this all the same underlying process? And then there's a guy at Peter Bent Brigham in Boston who is thinking about chronic inflammation that way and how it's part of so many clinical conditions, not all, but many, many, many. And that would be a mechanism that what's involved, say, in cancer may include the same mechanism of what's involved in heart disease. And that's where the uni disease idea comes from, that substrate to everything is what's key to understand. The same internist from Harvard, he was saying in my building where I work, we do cardiovascular on the first floor, renal on the second floor, pulmonary on the third floor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He says, it's kind of crazy because we're basically all studying the same thing. And that, to me, came close to the idea of what I've tried to think about as a uni disease concept.
Joan has a comment.
Okay, Joan, you're on next.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kerr. I bought the book, but I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. Nobody commented on 12 children, so I don't know what to say about it, but I was just wondering how that plays a part in everything, unless there's some kind of function it serves. You know, if they lived on a farm and they were working the farm, I guess that could be a help.
Yeah.
But I would think it'd be a stress, but I don't know if you have any comments on it.
Well, I remember, I think this was a phrase Murray sometimes used, reproduction run amok. And I thought this was a case of reproduction run amok. This family took on more than it could possibly adapt to. And that played a level in the chronic anxiety, no matter how hard Mimi worked at it. And she really busted her bippy to do right by these kids. And but it was just beyond what they could do. So that's the way I was thinking about it. It's reproduction run amok. And I think likely she blames him and he blames her for having these 12 kids. But I remember when the doctors after 10 boys said, you've got to get your tubes tied. She didn't go for it. No, I want 2 more. And she knew what she wanted. She wanted 12 kids. I don't know why. But reminded me of my mother when she was saying that, well, I had 4 boys. 3 of them turned out pretty well. But one of them was kind of a washout. Well, that's batting 250 in baseball. And this family's batting 125. It's run amok. I don't know, would you have another way of thinking about it?
No, I was just thinking, unless they lived on a farm, but that was maybe 100 years ago. A lot of
Yeah.
families had a lot of children who were workers. But yeah, I would think it'd be awful stressful.
Yeah, the book, it just exudes it, particularly when parents began to lose confidence. Then you get the father getting a serious illness at an early age 52, and how much more pressure that puts on the mother to take care of all these people. And she never doubted her desire to do that. And all the healthcare professionals noted that about her. The so-called, what was the warrior, brave warrior or something like that phrase.
Question from Amy Post.
Okay, Amy, back to,
Read that at the top of the chat room.
when did Don's move to dependence occur in relationship to Mary's growing up? I think he may mean independence. Does that shift move from Mimi and Don to inside rather than a kid for the first time? Let me reread that. I'm not sure I fully understood it.
I could put some words on it if that would be helpful.
Sure.
What I was thinking about how triangles shift, and if sometimes it's preferable to be in the inside position, but with this particular mom being on the inside position with her comes at a level of trading of self for both her and whoever's on the inside. And as Don comes into a dependency due to his illness and decline, does that free up the kids a little bit differently?
Well, by then, I forget what year he was 52, but
No, Dawn. Oh, Dawn.
Don, yeah. But yeah, she became a caretaker for him and the kids. I didn't read anything that led me to believe that things between her and the kids were all that different. I was particularly impressed toward the end where she talked about how much Donald being in her life meant to her. And I mean, he was like a companion for her, which is part and parcel of the other side of the process, anxious focus, but also a dependency operating on both sides. That example with Peter, I thought was beautiful for that, laying his head on his mother's chest, omnipotent mother taking care of dependent child, was the psychiatrist in Terp. And I thought he nailed it.
See this comment from Pamela. Mary Lindsay.
If Mary Lindsay were to come to you as a client, what do you see as the priorities for coaching her? I don't know. I'd certainly want to know more about, she's done a lot on her own. She did have therapy for 7 years, an individual framework, but the therapist seemed like an awfully good one, and she got a lot out of it. And if she came again later in life, I'd just say, congratulations on the objectivity you've already gained about looking at your family. It's pretty impressive. By staying in contact, Margaret, on the other hand, stays away. She just can't, if she gets too close to the family, she just takes on the problem. And Mary is able to be with the family and begin to think a little differently, being a little more forgiving of her parents. And I just think of that. It's this woman has gained some emotional objectivity in an unusual situation, like Murray left open. Differentiation of self is pretty much set by the time you leave home, barring a structured effort to change it or some unusual event that you had to challenge to deal with, like when seeing POWs in Vietnam when they got back. I mean, I believe some of those guys really did gain from living in that situation for an undetermined number of years, finally got out, mostly about 7 years. I forget if I'm too far afield from the question, but
the question was, if Mary Lindsay were to come as a client, what do you see as priorities for coaching?
oh yeah, I'd start out being real positive about what she's accomplished. I mean, I think she was able, partly because she could stay in contact, she had enough self to stay in contact through difficult times. And you know, when her mother was dying, she was the one that organized everything for help, and was angry sometimes at some that didn't help, like Margaret, which they settled that later on. So then we go from there. I don't know. I mean, if she came in to see me now, I'd love to meet her. But I don't know what the reason would be, other than I try to give her another way to think about what had happened in the family. And she might be receptive to that and find that very useful. You know, with a Bowen Theory explanation, speculation in a way, but application to their family. I've started out with 2 new people recently. The wife got interested in Bowen Theory. I think she read Roberta Gilbert's work. And then the husband started Googling things. And these 2 people started devouring Bowen Theory to the best of their ability. And then when they started the therapy, they were on the absolute verge of divorce. I didn't think they were going to make it. But only 4 or 5 sessions out, the wife, who was kind of moving in that direction more than the husband, saying, oh, I don't care, you go, didn't really mean it. But she was able to say, I don't want a divorce. I'm not ready to live in the same house with you again, but I don't want a divorce. I think we can, more progress needed to be made. And she's tried, they've split before and come back. Anyway, it just reminded me how much theory can help if people can be interested in theoretical thinking at the same time they're working on their own problem.
We got 3 questions in the queue, or comments. One is me, so I'll go first.
Okay.
And you have 2 more. So I was just sort of free associating about that quote you had at some point about psychosis being what the brain does when it's not
Disturbed.
working very well.
Yeah, not working very well.
And I mean, there's lots of ways to think about psychosis. You can also think about sort of escaping into psychosis, and it brings a kind of anxiety relief. But I was thinking back to the question about the unit disease, and I wondered if eventually, total speculation, whether brain inflammation will play any part in the waxing and waning of psychotic symptoms for people who are vulnerable.
Yeah, people are already considering that in schizophrenic episodes, that the inflammatory system is somehow playing a role there. I think that's more and more accepted.
So that there is some evidence about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So
Eric is next.
Okay, Eric in Vermont.
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
So I was thinking about this case that you just presented, and I've just gotten so much value from these cases over decades now, like the Kaczynski one. And I was having a thought somewhat similar to the one I had last month about Kathy's case, which is that, here you have this family where you have not only multiple schizophrenias, but also murders and suicides. And like with Kaczynski, the level of symptom, it goes well beyond schizophrenia, So I'm just thinking about this very, very extreme level of symptoms. And maybe a little bit, thinking about what Kim Ziegelman said earlier, that I don't have the sense in the Kaczynski case or in this one that these family details pointing to the undifferentiation provide a satisfactory explanation for the difference between that extreme level, like Uber level, versus the non-murdering schizophrenics, for example. I didn't have that same feeling about the Adam Lanza case as you presented it so clearly. But I just wondered if, I guess I was thinking maybe, what are the other factors along with the systems view so valuable? Maybe within the systems view, but currently unidentified, might help account for that.
The degree of dysfunction, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This very extreme level.
Yeah, I remember, I think I'm quoting Murray correctly. He said, homicide is at a little higher level than suicide. It really intrigued me that I never asked him exactly what he meant by that. He never wrote about it. But yeah, I mean, how do you judge the variation and explain it adequately? I don't think we can do that just yet. I mean, chronic anxiety is so incredibly difficult to measure, as far as we know. Yeah. Nobody, I think, has made a serious effort to try. Maybe they have.
Yeah.
I know Sapolsky had a nice graph that along the lines of every time you get a bleep in the immune system, it rises and falls. And next time maybe rises a little more and falls, et cetera, till it reaches the level it can unleash pathology. I don't know how he measured that or came to that idea, but I don't know, variation is what you're talking about, right? How to explain it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Kenton.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this presentation and am engaged by the book. I'm almost halfway through. Part of my interest is that I'm the 11th of 12, and my parents, I think, might have a slightly better batting average, but we had a great variety. And I was trying to just think about if to name at least some of the
There you
the
go.
basic processes in this family of just identified, just the denial of reality, kind of refusal of the family leaders to regulate behavior, and the way that a certain amount of lawlessness and demanding for the uniformity of thinking. And I don't know if it's because I'm co-opted by the emotional process in society, but my mind kept flipping to the societal process, and how this case study in the family informed some of my thinking and observing about processes in society. And may I just stop there given the time and just invite any comments about how, can we make the extension from studying the regression of this family and similar process observing in society? At least they seem apparent to me, but I just welcome your,
Well, I think this will seem relevant, but maybe I'm too far off. But when I read about this woman applying systems thinking to cancer, and then I thought about applying systems thinking to schizophrenia, that there seemed to be a lot of overlapping in the way the two people were thinking about it. And it gave me a little more confidence that yeah, I think when we look at Bowen theory in the future, more and more at many levels of organization and society and the animal kingdom, plant kingdom, we may see these parallels, but I don't think we see them very well yet. I mean, reciprocal functioning in the body is evident. Regression in the body is evident, although most people wouldn't call it a regression. I would call a growing cancer a regression, and this woman who's applying it with system thinking, I think agrees with that. She didn't use that word, but that what's going on with the cancer reflects what's going on in the larger context. It's not the cause does not reside internally to the cancer. But anyway, if I'm picking up on you, I think the future is seeing these parallels. Yeah.
Oops, we started late, so I was just going to permit myself the luxury of one other comment.
Sure.
I was struck with your comment about the immune system, sort of each spike priming it for going higher the next time. And I was thinking about having had two aggressive rescue dogs, and one of whom we had to put down eventually, and how each time it happened, next time it seemed to happen faster and quicker. And I'm just thinking that's probably a similar, that adrenaline hyper rush is probably something similar to what they're observing in the immune system. There are probably similar processes in a number of different bodily systems that once they get going, they sort of sensitize, I guess, and increase the probability that it'll be an even bigger response the next time.
Yeah, I wish I could think of the article where I first read this, but this idea of habituation, where apparently through the evolution to more and more complexity, the capacity to habituate. In other words, if you react at level 10 the first time it happens, then you react at level 7 next time, then 4, then 2. That you habituate, you're kind of prepared. You're talking about just the opposite, potentiate. And I don't know, it's just an interesting thing to think about. I don't usually think that way, what potentiates, but it's a good idea.
Well, that's what I thought you were reporting about, the immune response that had been observed.
Yeah, that definitely, according to Sapolsky, potentiated until it reached the point of a visible symptom. I don't see a number in the chat. Oh, okay, let's wrap up. Yeah, I have a 3 o'clock appointment I gotta do right now. Oh yeah, we're wrapping up. I just thought everybody knew. Thanks for coming. See you in the fall. COVID free, hopefully. Doubt it, but hopefully.